we found that 98% of men were passing these fitness tests, but only 92% of women were passing these fitness tests. Therefore, to avoid any claim of indirect discrimination, we are going to allow all of these formerly unfit officers back onto the beat. When it comes to employment and promotion decisions, you should be making them exclusively on merit.
A new report from the Institute of Economic Affairs claims that stripping back aspects of the Equality Act will actually boost workplace diversity and employee protections. The report outlines several key suggestions, which include abolishing the concept of indirect discrimination in the UK, stop outlawing different pay for different work, and repealing the public sector equality duty. But can the government really improve diversity by basically getting down or getting rid of the diversity, equality and inclusion stuff? Let's find out, shall we? Joining now is one of the authors of the report, Daniel Freeman, who is also the managing editor at the Institute for Economic Affairs. Now, this is an exclusive. Thank you very much for coming in, Daniel. Good to see you. Now, tell me in a nutshell what this is about.
So, part of the reason why we decided to write this report is endlessly politicians are complaining about the consequences of the Equality Act and discrimination legislation. So how many times have you had politicians come on here and say, oh, it's terrible how many diversity managers the NHS is having to employ, or this decision or that decision it makes no sense. What we're saying is all of this comes from law and from legislation that can be modified. So what we do in the report is we go through the history of anti-discrimination legislation in Britain that starts in the 1960s to tackle, very real examples of racial discrimination. But at that stage, it's very focused on what we'd call direct discrimination. So you have a job, you say, we are not taking X ethnic group, or we are not taking Y ethnic group, or in housing or some area like that. What has increasingly emerged and become much more important is this idea of indirect discrimination. So this isn't discrimination where you're not necessarily trying to discriminate, or you're not preventing people from doing one job or another, but you have policies that might advantage one group over another, and it can lead to some really perverse outcomes if you go down the line that every example of this must be stopped. So I'll give you one example. Last year, the British Transport Police got rid of yearly fitness tests for their officers. And they said that, well, we're doing this because we found that 98% of men were passing these fitness tests, but only 92% of women were passing these fitness tests. Therefore, to avoid any claim of indirect discrimination, we are going to allow all of these formerly unfit officers back onto the beat. Which
doesn't help anyone.
Well, yeah, not least the officers themselves. Yeah. I'm not sure I'd particularly want to be out, on Britain's railways if I'm actually not capable of doing a bleep test.
So are we saying that we really need to stop positive discrimination?
Well, that is another area that was changed with the 2010 Equality Act. It brought in this notion of positive action. And that previously hadn't been an element in British law. If you go back to the 1970s, you do have this notion of positive action, but it only refers to training schemes, things like that. And as far as we're concerned, that's not an issue. But when it comes to employment and promotion decisions, you should be making them exclusively on merit.
OK, so now, this is your report. It's exclusive on GB News today. And are you going to give this to the government and see what reaction you get?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we'll give it to anyone who's interested in it. And, on one level, the current government haven't made particularly good sort of sounds on this. They've proposed introducing a Race Equality Act, which would introduce some of the elements on gender discrimination, such as mandatory reporting on pay gaps also to include ethnicity, which would be a complete nightmare because you have lots of, you have a lot more ethnicities than you do genders. So that's encouraging, but, there are some grounds for hope. The government do seem to be pushing in on a sort of deregulatory agenda. They are aware that there are some areas like environmental legislation where, environmental regulation where, it sounds very good on paper, but in reality, you end up with £100 million back caves. And it's very much like that with anti-discrimination legislation and the Equality Act. A lot of it sounds good on paper, but then when it filters through into the public sector, you get really perverse outcomes.
So are we talking a bit like Trump in America, that the best person for the job should get the job regardless of their sex, their race, their religion, their disabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that to a large extent does happen in the private sector because you do have a profit motive.
Yeah.
That it doesn't matter how woke you are if you're not actually making money.
Really, yeah.
In the public sector, you don't necessarily have those signals. So in the public sector, in Quangos, you probably do need government to sort of step in and say, look, focus on merit, focus on individuals, not on identity or group outcomes.
OK, very interesting stuff. Unfortunately, we haven't got time to bring the panel on this, but we will let them have a say later because we can't shut them up, basically. Daniel Freeman, thank you very much for coming in.